Rewilding is going to save the world. No scientist in our modern era has ever witnessed the true carrying capacity and biodiversity of planet Earth. It's all been so degraded, but the most incredible news is that by just planting native plants, we can rebuild ecologies in just 20 years. What is rewilding? Rewilding is the principle of land management where you create self-willed ecosystems by kind of stepping back. By putting together the component pieces of an ecosystem and then doing less, we can create healthy and thriving self-willed ecosystems. There are a couple of really incredible large-scale projects around the world: Yellowstone National Park, Kneps Farm, Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands. These are all some multi-acre projects where they put together as many missing native plants and missing native animals as possible and allowed them to interact with each other in order to manage the land and create healthy, thriving ecosystems. In Yellowstone National Park in the 90s, they noticed that there were no new aspen, and also that the creeks were eroding and that there were no willow lining the banks of the creeks anymore. And they could tell that there were no new aspen in exactly the amount of time as the last wolf was shot in the 1930s. So a group of conservationists worked to reintroduce wolves back into Yellowstone National Park. The goal, of course, was to replace the aspen and to somehow fix the eroding banks of the creeks. But what happened blew everyone's mind out of the water and made it clear that we, of the people of the last 200 years, have absolutely no idea the true incredible carrying capacity of the land. When the wolves were reintroduced, the large grazers were no longer able to linger in the meadows and overgraze the meadows, which is why there were no new aspen. They were eating all the aspen until there were none left. But not only did the aspen return, but shrubs and thickets and marginal places in between the open grasslands and the wooded spaces returned. And in those spaces, insects returned and birds returned and small critters. And with every year, the amount of carrying capacity of the land grew exponentially more than the year before, growing on the baseline that had been established the year prior. And in the span of 20 years, which is really a single generation, the entire landscape evolved to not a perfect facsimile, but to become a close facsimile of what the land had been before human intervention. Kneps Farm is a project in Britain that's also from the 90s, an estate that had a wooded area that was once a hunting preserve, but had been used since the 50s as grazing land for dairy cows. The estate at Kneps Farm was no longer solvent, the land was truly degraded, and it wasn't a very productive dairy. So in the 90s, they decided to rewild the 200 acres that constitutes the estate. They started by reintroducing native plants and reintroducing as many native animals and cognates of native animals as possible, and allowed them to interact in a natural way. Britain was once a super important breeding grounds for native birds coming out of Africa that would migrate into Britain, breed, and then return to Africa after the breeding season. A lot of these birds were thought to exist only in the most extreme extent places like the tops of mountains. However, what they discovered at Kneps Farm was really incredible. For every year that a new species of bird would be introduced, the following year there would be an exponentially more, and the following year after that, exponentially more. And it all started by introducing native plants, which then fostered native insects, which fed all of the missing native birds. And what's so incredible is that in the span of 20 years, Kneps Farm has become the most important breeding ground for birds coming out of Africa in all of Britain. It all starts with planting native plants, and anyone can do that wherever they are. You can do it, and I can do it too. It's scalable. You do not have to have 200 acres to pull it off. You can do it on a pot in your balcony, your front garden, your backyard, and you can encourage your garden centers to start carrying native plants and your friends to plant native plants as well. My friend Nicole was saying how she had never seen Ceanothus silk moth, which is a giant, gorgeous red moth, in her own garden in Guerneville, and she's lived there for a number of years, and that we wanted to summon them, and so we planted Ceanothus. And within just 4 weeks, she saw her first Ceanothus silk moth and was moved to tears. You can do it too. What is it that you want to see in your own garden? You can plant the plants that will bring them back. Insects are co-evolved to eat a specific plant. So specific plants have an associated specific insect, and specific insects always eat a specific plant. So in my own garden, I focused on planting native plants that I knew were going to feed certain insects. With the goal, of course, of promoting the amount of populations of other animals, birds and lizards and other things. Every year I have a survey taken of all of the different animals and birds on my property, and I've only been there for 3 years. Last year, there were 12 different species of birds present on the property, and this year there are 28. 28 is exponential growth. Last year there were a couple of reptiles. There was one alligator lizard and one gardener snake that I knew of in my own garden. And this spring, thanks to the populations of all the insects, there were hundreds of little tiny baby snakes. Snakes are not for everyone. They dispersed after just a few weeks and they're mostly all gone, but there were hundreds of them where there had been only one, and also hundreds of different lizards all in the garden, most of which I had never seen before. If you're like me, you have a lot of anxiety about the state of the world and what's going to happen next. But this is a call for action. There's a simple thing that you can do to help regenerate the world, and it's just as simple as planting native plants. If we were to rewild 10% of the world's least productive agricultural spaces, or instead suburban gardens, we could biosequester enough carbon to offset all of climate change and do nothing else. Nothing. The implications are incredible and profound and so simple. We can plant natives and save ourselves from ourselves in a single generation. And now you know how